How fast do you have to be to play the new Super R-Type for Super NES? This fast.
Super R-Type from Irem for Super NES. See how good you really are.
In the mid to late 1980s, the shoot-'em-up genre, or shmups, were commonly seen in arcades, but was something that didn't really translate well to home consoles. And that was mainly due to the power difference between an arcade machine of that time and the much weaker 8-bit home consoles. These games really pushed hardware to their limits back in the day because they focused on fast-paced action, with a lot of fast-moving enemies and projectiles on screen at once, all while automatically scrolling the screen either horizontally or vertically, all while providing a strong atmosphere with its visuals and soundtrack. These games were a great profit maker for arcades back in the mid to late 80s, and in the 90s they finally made faithful ports to home consoles that were much more tolerable than the ones on the 8-bit systems. But even though these consoles were much more powerful, they still pushed the home consoles to their limit, and this would cause the game to slow down sometimes on home systems, in my opinion on the Super Nintendo in particular. But let's go ahead and take a look at a few of these games and see how they hold up today. As I mentioned previously in this video series, Super R-Type was my first experience with a scrolling shooter game on the Super Nintendo. It was developed and published by Irem in 1991, and I believe this is one of the first games my brothers picked up for the system after we got our Super Nintendo. As I've already covered this in the earlier part, I'm just going to leave it here by saying this was my first experience, but it wasn't until much later that I ended up playing this game's sequel. R-Type 3, The Third Lightning, was released on the Super Nintendo in 1993, again published by Irem, and this time developed by Tamtex. As with Super R-Type, this game takes place in a futuristic setting where you control the R-Type spacecraft against the evil Bido Empire. The game features classic side-scrolling gameplay, challenging levels, and a variety of powerful weapons and upgrades. With its iconic Force Pod that can be positioned to shield the player and enhance firepower, this is the first game in the series to introduce different Force Pods. This game, in my opinion, is a much bigger improvement over its predecessor, and I say that as a person who has been a longtime fan of Super R-Type. The graphics are more impressive, as I feel that they had a better handle on the hardware by the end of 1993. The gameplay is excellent, and I feel that having different Force Pods definitely varies up the gameplay a lot more than in the previous entry. The levels are designed uniquely enough to introduce new enemies and obstacles, and requires players to have quick reflexes and again pattern recognition. However, the game is challenging, as most shoot-'em-ups are. For those of you that like a challenge, this is one you're definitely going to enjoy, but if you're not a fan of grinding through the same sections of a game over and over again, this one could get very repetitive and tedious to you. Something else notable about R-Type 3 is the inclusion of branching paths. At certain points, players can choose between two different routes, adding replayability and providing alternative challenges. The soundtrack is back in all of its glory, as I really enjoyed the soundtrack of Super R-Type. This one adds many more classic themes. I just can't say enough good things about this game. If you're a fan of shoot-'em-ups, this is one you're definitely going to enjoy. I would rank it more towards the hardcore shoot-'em-up market, and if you're going to get this game physically, I also recommend it to hardcore collectors because the North American version of this game is super expensive. So I ended up picking this up on my Super Famicom. Darius Twin is one of the earliest games released for the Super Nintendo, and again this is one I picked up on my Super Famicom, and I've already reviewed this earlier in the series. But its sequel, Darius Force, also known as Supernova here in the US, was released again in December of 1993 for the Super Nintendo, and this game is a decent enough continuation of the series, but it's not one that I particularly enjoyed. Supernova puts players in control of a spacecraft as they battle against yet another hostile alien force. This game is another horizontally scrolling shooter with waves of enemies, powerful bosses, and a branching path system, as well as the ability to customize and upgrade your ship, allowing some strategy on how to attack each level. Again, I think this is a solid enough game and delivers an enjoyable shoot-'em-up experience. The game's graphics are well designed, have detailed sprites, vibrant backgrounds, as well as creative enemy designs. However, this game didn't really stand out to me when I was playing scrolling shooters. It was just another enjoyable experience, and fairly average and mediocre in my opinion. Looking at other review scores of this game, I can see around a 5.5 to 7 out of 10 ranking, and I would give it around a 7 out of 10, just kind of an overall meh kind of score. The Raiden series got a start in the arcades in 1990, and eventually ended up gracing a plethora of home systems, including the Super Nintendo, with the game Raiden Densetsu in Japan and Raiden Trad in the United States, with Trad being short for Raiden Traditional, which is a loose translation of Raiden Densetsu. This game is a vertically scrolling shooter that is heavily reliant on power-ups for you to be able to defeat enemies. The game's graphical style does look a little bit primitive to me, but it's kind of expected for early shooters on the system, and this is one of the first games where I've noticed that I have a hard time sometimes distinguishing between what's the background and what's on the foreground. But overall it isn't too bad. I don't think the game is that challenging by any means, but where I really have a problem with it is when you die, you lose all of your power-ups, and if this happens at the wrong part of the game, you pretty much have to start all over. I know this game series has gained a huge fan base over time, so it's not really one that I really want to say is skippable, but I don't think the first game is the one that you want to start with, as again, this one just seems fairly average to me. Now here's a game I didn't even know existed on the Super Nintendo until I was doing this review, as I associate the Thunder Force series a lot more with the Sega Genesis. This game, Thunder Spirits, is a port of the game Thunder Force 3. This game features detailed backgrounds and sprites, as well as creative enemy designs, and I think has an aesthetic that is overall appealing, at least to me. And the soundtrack is a complete banger. I mean, this game has a great soundtrack. The gameplay is solid and doesn't slow down too much, although you will notice it in certain areas of the game, just like with most of the other Super Nintendo shooters. But one of my biggest criticisms of this game is the fact that sometimes the backgrounds are so loud or distracting that it's sometimes hard to see enemies and projectiles coming at you because the background is constantly moving as well. Overall, this is a very decent game, and I'd give it around a 7.5 out of 10, but just know this game did come out on the Sega Genesis, and I do think they did it better on that console. The next game I'm going to look at is Phalanx, and if you take a look at the box art of this game, you'll wonder what in the world is this game doing in a shooter review. Well, at some point the marketing team decided that it was better to put an elderly man dressed in overalls wearing a fedora and playing a banjo, while having a futuristic spaceship fly in the background to denote this is a scrolling shooter. Apparently there was a lot of competition in this market in the mid-90s, and they wanted to find a way to stand out and show them something completely original. But anyway, this game was published by Kemco and released on the Super Nintendo in 1992. In this game, you play as a lone spaceship trying to defeat an alien invasion. As expected, this game features intense and challenging gameplay where you have to face off against a wave of enemies, each with their own attack patterns. The game's graphics are very well done on the system, but sometimes can look a little muddied down for my taste. The game's soundtrack has some catchy themes that will keep you from getting bored during your playthrough, and overall, it's actually a pretty solid experience. Now, I've seen some reviews of this game give it around a 5 out of 10, but I'd say 7.5 out of 10 seems about right for me. You don't need to go out of your way to collect this one, but it's also not too bad if you do. game Axelay was developed and published by Konami, hitting the Super Nintendo in September of 1992 in North America. And this game takes players on a thrilling intergalactic journey as they control the advanced fighter spacecraft known as the Axelay. This game has a combination of side-scrolling and vertically scrolling stages, each filled with intense action, diverse enemies, and challenging boss encounters. The game has impressive graphics, engaging gameplay, and a memorable soundtrack. This is another prime example of what you want to see from the best of this genre. This is one that I had a hard time putting down once I popped the cartridge into my system. And I would recommend it to most of you out there, however, I am going to note the game's difficulty level is insanely high. And I say that fully realizing that this genre is not known for having easy games. So again, while I'd like to recommend this to everybody, it's definitely going to have to be better suited to hardcore enthusiasts of this genre. As of the time of this review, it was pretty expensive for a North American copy, so again I got this for my Super Famicom, but I'd recommend giving this one a try if you have the chance. Very quickly, I wanted to mention some of the other titles I played for this review that I also found fun. Aero Fighters is another game that I enjoyed on the system, featuring smooth controls, impressive sprite graphics, and a range of power-ups and weapons that enhance its gameplay. With its addicting gameplay and thrilling action, I would give this around an 8 out of 10, definitely recommend it. In the game BioMetal, again taking place in a futuristic world, players pilot a powerful mecha suit and blast through waves of enemies across multiple visually varied levels. The game features a good balance of challenge and excitement, with a fast-paced gameplay, tight controls, and a variety of weapons to upgrade. While it may not be as well known as other games, I've found this one to be a solid shoot-'em-up experience. I'd give it about a 7 out of 10. BlaZeon was interesting, but seemed kind of primitive to me, even for the standards set on the Super Nintendo. You do take control of a transforming spaceship that can switch between flying and a walking form, which is something I haven't seen in too many other games of this genre. Review scores are all over the place with this one, but I'd give it around a 6 out of 10. Not really one I typically enjoyed, but could be enjoyable to some people. Firepower 2000 is another scrolling shooter which kind of switches it up by having you control either a helicopter or a jeep. The jeep can fire in any direction, but can't always move over mapped obstacles, and the helicopter is the exact opposite. The game does have tight and responsive controls, as well as intense boss battles, and a very satisfying gameplay with an enjoyable co-op mode. I'd give this one around a 7 out of 10 as well, recommending it to some. Space MegaForce, also known as Super Aleste in Europe, is a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up. This game offers a wide variety of power-ups and weapons, allowing for strategic customization and intense firepower, but with its polished gameplay, smooth controls, and memorable soundtrack, this one earns an 8 out of 10 for me, and I would recommend it for most people. And another game I found quite enjoyable was Super Earth Defense Force for the Super Nintendo. This game also has a wide array of power-ups and weapons to upgrade. The game is very well done with great graphics, a memorable soundtrack, and an overall tight gameplay experience that kept me coming back to it. And overall, I'd give this one about a 7.5 out of 10. Star Fox is the only game on this list that has a 3D first-person perspective rather than a side-scrolling or top-down vertical view. But in terms of all the games released for the Super Nintendo, this game was definitely one of the most important. It has been hard to replicate the feeling that most of us felt when we first popped this cartridge into our Super Nintendo and saw this epic scene play out before our eyes. This was certainly something that we had never seen before on the Super Nintendo or any other 16-bit console, and this would be a landmark title in the 16-bit war between Super Nintendo and Sega. First, in this game, you take control of Fox McCloud, the leader of the Star Fox team, in a mission to save the Lilat system from the evil forces of Andross. To do this, you will pilot an R-Wing spacecraft through various levels, engaging in dogfights, tackling obstacles, and facing off against giant, imposing bosses. The gameplay is fairly simplistic to understand. You have lasers, bombs, and a shield that you have to manage in order to make it through each level. The game features an overworld map which will allow you to choose from the very beginning which path you want to take to get to the final boss. Each one is basically different difficulty settings. However, and this is a story that's been told 1,000 times, so I'll try to be brief, this game was revolutionary for its use of polygon graphics and the Super FX chip. Which really, the Super FX chip is just a coprocessor that allows the Super Nintendo to complete more calculations needed for polygons than the original system could handle. But because of the limitations of the system, most of these are flat shaded polygons, and there's not a lot of detail in the enemies or the graphics, but in this simplicity, they have an art style which works for this game. The game's soundtrack was also very ambitious, having several orchestral accompaniments to give it more of a grand epic adventure scale. And looking back on this, especially if you didn't grow up in this era, it may be very hard to understand why this game was so impactful in the video game industry. At the time that this game came out, gaming PCs could barely do 3D graphics, and the competing like consoles in the 16-bit arena had to have an add-on to increase the capabilities of their system, but Nintendo was able to get away with it by putting the technology within one cartridge, making it seem like it's something the Super Nintendo could always do. This was at a time where marketing of each video game system was pushing how powerful their consoles were compared to the competition, and each game system was trying to do something to make it stand out amongst the others. When in reality, each of them had very similar power, just different ways of getting there. It was a pretty genius move on Nintendo's part to release a game that can do full 3D graphics, granted in a very primitive scale, but better than their competition, without any sort of add-on, adding to the magic trick that was this game. Looking at it today, I would say this runs at about, 10 to 15 frames a second, so it is kind of hard to go back to, especially since the N64 and GameCube have definitely done this better. However, for me, I have no problem going back to this game because it's one I grew up with, played a lot of times, but I never owned it due to its expense. I had to rent it from our video rental store whenever it was in stock. A lot of times I'd go there, this game was checked out, and I'd have to settle for another game until hopefully the next time it would be in. Now if you notice, I've been saying a lot more about this game's importance in gaming history than I have about the game itself. Overall, the gameplay is fun and engaging, but it's not the best scrolling shooter I've ever played in the 3D format, but it is the first. So with that in mind, with the wow factor being taken away, this game is still fun and engaging, and one that I would recommend that at least everybody try on their Super Nintendo, and is something I still find myself wanting to play to this day. So there you have it, that is a look at the scrolling shooter games that are available for the Super Nintendo. And there are a fair amount on this system considering the genre's popularity at the time. And while this genre of game has faded in popularity, there is still a dedicated fanbase out there that enjoys games like this, and I want to know if you are one of them and if you played any of the games on my list, or if any of these looked interesting to you. That said, that is going to wrap things up for this video. In the next part, we're going to look at more shooting games, but in a different style, as we look at the run and guns. So stay tuned for that video coming out to you real soon. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.